My name is Cora Bellamy. For 27 years, my life has been woven into the fabric of Redwood Mills, a company that did more than just make paper. It crafted legacies. My father, Robert Bellamy, founded it not on principles of profit, but on a philosophy of permanence. He believed that the finest paper wasn't a disposable commodity, but a vessel for history, for wedding vows, for birth announcements, for peace treaties, and first novels. He loved the scent of pressed cotton, the weight of a heavy bond sheet, the subtle watermark that was our quiet signature of quality. He built our headquarters in the small, rain-washed city of Northwood, not in a glass tower, but in a restored brick textile mill overlooking the Cascade River, where the sound of the water was a constant, gentle reminder of the natural world we sought to honor. I grew up in the shadow of that mill. My first job, at 16, was sweeping wood pulp dust from the warehouse floors. I learned the business from the ground up, not in a classroom, but from the men and women whose hands, calloused and knowing, transformed raw fiber into art. When my father passed, he didn't leave me a fortune, but a responsibility. I became the head of heritage and quality, a title that sounded archaic to outsiders, but was, to us, the soul of the company. My primary duty, and my most profound honor, was the annual Guild Accord in Florence. It was more than a business trip. It was a pilgrimage. Our most exclusive paper line, the Bellamy Parchment, was certified by the Consorzio della Carta Nobile, a Florentine guild that had overseen artisan papermaking since the Renaissance. Every spring, I would fly to Florence to meet with Signor Alessandro Conti, the guild's elderly patriarch. We would share an espresso, review our production methods, and he would inspect our samples, his ancient, ink-stained fingers tracing the fibers with a reverence that mirrored my father's. The trip was a renewal of vows, a handshake that secured our standing and allowed us to use their coveted seal. It was also a journey home, in a way. My mother was from Florence, and in the quiet hours after the meetings, I would walk the cobbled streets she'd walked, visiting the small chapel where she was baptized, finding a piece of her and of myself in the ochre-tinted light of Tuscany. This tradition, this delicate and essential thread connecting our small Northwood mill to the heart of the old world, was about to be severed. His name was Julian Croft. He arrived not like a new manager, but like a conquering general, armed with a freshly minted MBA and a vocabulary of disruption. He was tall, sharp-edged, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He saw Redwood Mills not as a legacy to be stewarded, but as an underperforming asset to be liquidated for parts. He replaced the framed photographs of our craftsmen with sterile motivational posters that read, "Data is the new soil," and "Tradition is peer pressure from dead people." The blow came during a quarterly strategy meeting in the main conference room where the long oak table, built by my father and his friends, still bore the faint scent of lemon oil polish. Julian stood before a blindingly white PowerPoint slide, a laser pointer in his hand. Moving forward, he announced, his voice echoing with practiced confidence, "We'll be identifying and eliminating all non-essential, high-cost legacy practices. This includes sentimental expenditures that don't translate to measurable ROI." His eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, swept the room and landed on me. "For instance, the annual pilgrimage to Italy," he said, a small, dismissive smirk playing on his lips. "A charming tradition, I'm sure, but a highly inefficient one. We're not in the business of funding European holidays. From now on, all certifications will be handled digitally. It's faster, cheaper, and aligns with our new vision of a streamlined, globally competitive Redwood." The room went silent. The gentle hum of the HVAC system seemed to roar in the sudden vacuum. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me, people like old Gus from the pulp room, who had taught me how to test pH levels with litmus paper, like Helen from accounting, who had attended my father's funeral. Their faces were a mixture of shock and pity. They knew what that trip meant. It wasn't a vacation, it was our heart. I looked at Julian, at his crisp, joyless suit and the soulless glow of the screen behind him. He wasn't just cutting a budget line, he was severing an artery. He saw a number, an expense of a few $1,000s. I saw a relationship built over a quarter century, a seal of quality that was priceless, a promise made by my father that I had dutifully kept. I wanted to stand up and scream. I wanted to explain the nuance, the history, the quiet, unquantifiable value of a human connection. I wanted to tell him that Senior Conti would never respond to a digital form, that he believed trust was something he looked a man in the eye to earn. But I saw the look on Julian's face. It was the look of a man who had already made up his mind, a man for whom history was a liability. Arguing would be pointless. It would be seen as emotional, as resistant, as legacy drag. So I did the only thing I could. I met his gaze, held it for a beat, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of agreement. It was a nod of acknowledgement. He wanted the reins. I was going to give them to him. And I knew, with the kind of deep, chilling certainty that settles in your bones, that he had no idea how to hold them. That afternoon, a quiet grief settled over me. It was a strange, hollow feeling, like walking through a home you once loved, now emptied of all its furniture. I sat at my desk, the one my father had used, its surface scarred with decades of hard work and thoughtful pauses. I ran my hand over the familiar grain of the wood. The changes Julian was making felt like a violation, an erasure of everything my father had built. My first act was one of quiet compliance. I logged into the company travel portal and canceled my flight to Florence. The system charged a non-refundable fee of $700, a pittance that felt like an insult. I then composed an email. My fingers felt heavy on the keyboard, each keystroke a small act of surrender. The recipient was Mia, Julian's new executive assistant. She was barely 23, bright-eyed and perpetually anxious, a girl who seemed to subsist on iced coffee and the desperate need for approval. She was a reflection of the new culture, energetic, fluent in corporate buzzwords, and utterly lacking in institutional knowledge. Subject: Transition of Florentine Guild Accord Responsibilities. Dear Mia, as per Julian Croft's new directive, I am formally transitioning all responsibilities related to the annual Guild Accord with the Consorzio della Carta Nobile. Attached, you will find a complete digital archive of all historical documentation, including past agreements, procedural notes, and the direct contact information for Senior Alessandro Conti in Florence. The deadline for the annual renewal is June 15th. This is a firm deadline, and the Consorzio does not send reminders. Please confirm that you have received these materials and will be overseeing the renewal process to completion. Please let me know if you have any questions. Warmly, Cora Bellamy. I copied Julian on the email. It was a clean, professional handover. I had given her everything she needed: the history, the contact, the deadline. A roadmap to success. I hit send, and the message vanished into the digital ether. Days turned into a week. There was no reply. I saw the read receipt. Mia had opened it. Julian had opened it. But their silence was a statement in itself. The matter was closed. It was their responsibility now. A part of me, a small, stubborn part, wanted to march into Julian's office, to follow up, to warn him. But a newer, stronger part of me held me back. It was a lesson my father had tried to teach me about self-respect. You can't make someone value what you offer, Cora, he used to say. You can only present it. If they choose not to see it, you must respect yourself enough to walk away. Julian was building his own version of Redwood Mills, one brick of jargon at a time. The old, comfortable silence of the mill was replaced by the frantic clicking of keyboards and the chirpy announcements of mandatory synergy sessions. He walked the halls with an air of restless energy, pointing out inefficiencies, questioning time-honored processes. He called the deep, resonant chime of the old grandfather clock in the lobby a non-productive auditory distraction, and had it silenced. He would often make small, cutting remarks in meetings, always with a polished smile. We need to move past the "that's how we've always done it" mindset, he'd say, with a pointed glance in my direction. Some of our most tenured employees are our biggest hurdles to innovation. I learned to smile back, a placid, unreadable expression I was perfecting. I became an observer in my own home. My colleagues noticed the change in me. Old Gus stopped by my desk one afternoon, his hands dusted with a fine white powder of chalk. "You all right, Cora?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Heard about the Florence trip." "That's a damn shame." "New management, new priorities," I said, offering him a weak smile. "We're streamlining." He just shook his head slowly, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "Some things ain't meant to be streamlined," he muttered, before shuffling away. His words stayed with me. He was right. You can't streamline trust. You can't digitize a legacy. The lack of response to my email gnawed at me, not with panic, but with a sense of grim duty. This was no longer just about a missed deadline, it was about the potential destruction of my father's life's work. I couldn't stop it, but I could document its demise. I began to build an archive, a secret history of the fall. I created a folder on my personal drive, hidden within layers of other files, and named it Garden Plans. Inside, I saved every email from Julian, every memo announcing a new, ill-conceived policy, every meeting agenda where my role was subtly diminished. I saved a screenshot of my email to Mia, complete with the read receipt timestamp. I printed a hard copy and filed it away in a locked drawer in my desk, the one that still held a few of my father's old fountain pens. I felt like a historian, cataloging the last days of a civilization. There was no malice in it, only a profound sense of sadness and a quiet determination to preserve the truth. The truth of what was being lost and the truth of who was responsible for losing it. The deadline, June 15th, was circled in red on the calendar on my wall. It was a beautiful old letterpress calendar we made in-house every year. Each day I looked at it, it felt less like a date and more like a premonition. The air in the mill grew heavier with unspoken anxieties. The more Julian talked about agility and growth hacking, the more the foundations seemed to shake. One evening, I stayed late, long after the frantic energy of the day had subsided. The mill was quiet again, filled with the familiar sense of paper and ink and the gentle sigh of the river outside. I walked through the darkened production floor, the massive presses standing silent like sleeping iron giants. I ran my hand along a stack of freshly cut Bellamy parchment, its texture like fine linen beneath my fingers. A wave of grief washed over me so powerful it almost buckled my knees. This place was more than a job. It was my history, my identity, my last tangible link to my father. And I was watching a stranger tear it down, piece by piece, with a smile on his face. In that moment, I understood what I had to do. It wasn't about fighting Julian. It was about honoring my father. And the most honorable thing I could do was to uphold the standards he had set, even if it meant simply bearing witness to their destruction. I would not interfere. I would not save them from themselves. I would let the consequences of their choices unfold, just as my father would have, believing that truth, like water, eventually finds its own level. I went back to my office, took a deep breath, and waited for the ticking clock to finally strike midnight. The first tremor came on a Tuesday morning in late June. It arrived as a single line in a logistics report from our European distributor. Shipment 7A4 Bellamy parchment delayed at Port of Livorno pending Consorzio certification review. It was a small flag, easily missed by anyone who didn't know what to look for. I saw it immediately. I saved a copy to my Garden Plans folder and continued my work. A few hours later, a frantic email landed in my inbox, forwarded from the general customer service queue. It was from a prestigious London stationer, one of our oldest clients. Subject: Urgent. Order 8821. Certificate of Quality missing. We are unable to process our latest shipment of Bellamy parchment. The standard certificate of quality from the Florentine Guild is not being recognized by customs. Can you please advise immediately? Our clients are waiting. I forwarded the email to Mia and Julian without comment. An hour passed. Julian replied to the thread, his tone breezy and dismissive. Mia, please look into this. Probably a clerical error on the port's end. Reach out to the Italian logistics team and have them sort it. Mia's reply was almost immediate. On it. I watched the exchange with a strange sense of detachment. It was like watching a play where I already knew the tragic ending. They were treating a heart attack like a case of indigestion. They didn't understand that the clerical error was the entire system shutting down. The Consorcio's seal wasn't a sticker, it was a key. And their key no longer worked. By Thursday, the tremors had become a full-blown earthquake. The entire European distribution channel for our high-end paper lines had seized up. Shipments were being impounded. Alarms were flashing red on dashboards in departments that had never even heard of the Consorcio. The word certification was being whispered in panicked tones in the hallways. Julian's confidence began to fray at the edges. He called an emergency meeting with the heads of logistics, sales, and IT. I was not invited. I sat at my desk, the closed door of the conference room just visible from my seat. I could hear the muffled sound of his voice, louder and sharper than usual. Later that afternoon, Mia appeared at my desk. Her face was pale, and the perpetual anxiety in her eyes had curdled into outright fear. "Cora," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Julian, he wants to know if you have any old contacts in Florence. Someone who could help with this customs thing." I looked at her, this young woman so completely out of her depth, a casualty of a culture that had mistaken confidence for competence. I felt a pang of pity for her. "All the contacts I have were in the file I sent you in April, Mia," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Senior Conti is the only person who can resolve this." "I tried emailing him," she said, her voice cracking. "I've emailed him 5 times. He won't answer. I even tried calling, but his assistant just says he's unavailable." Of course, he was unavailable. To a stranger sending frantic, impersonal emails, he would always be unavailable. Trust was a currency he did not trade in digitally. "I'm sorry, Mia. I can't help you," I said, and the words felt both true and profoundly sad. My authority on this matter was officially revoked. "It's out of my hands." She stared at me, her eyes pleading, before she turned and scurried back toward Julian's office like a frightened mouse. The official letter arrived the next morning. It wasn't an email. It was a physical document, delivered by international courier, addressed directly to the CEO, Mr. Albright, a kind, quiet man who had been my father's partner for 30 years. It was from the Consorzio della Carta Nobile. An emergency board meeting was called for 11 a.m. This time, I was invited. I walked into the conference room with a black leather portfolio under my arm. Inside was a single, neatly printed document, a chronological timeline of every communication, every directive, and every warning since Julian Croft had first uttered the words, "sentimental expenditure." The mood in the room was funereal. Mr. Albright sat at the head of the table, his face grim. Julian was there, looking pale and disheveled. He had a sheen of sweat on his forehead. Mr. Albright cleared his throat. He held up the letter from Florence. "I received this an hour ago," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "It is a formal notice from the Consorcio. Effective June 15th, due to a failure to renew our annual accord, our certification for the Bellamy Parchment line and all associated heritage lines has been indefinitely suspended." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Suspension is the least of our worries. The Consorcio's charter, which we signed 30 years ago, includes a penalty clause. For every day we operate without a valid seal, we are liable for a fine of 10,000 euros. Per day." A collective gasp went through the room. I did the math in my head. It had been over 2 weeks. We were already facing a liability of more than 150,000 euros, and it was climbing. "Furthermore, Mr. Albright continued, his gaze hardening as it fell on Julian, "our largest European client is threatening to terminate their contract, citing a breach of our quality guarantee. The total financial exposure, between the fines and the lost business, could be catastrophic." He finally looked directly at Julian. "I want an explanation. Now." Julian swallowed hard. He straightened his tie, a futile gesture of composure. "There was a breakdown in the new streamline process," he stammered, his voice losing its usual booming confidence. The task was delegated to my assistant. There was a communication lapse. A communication lapse? Mr. Albright's voice was dangerously quiet. Or a leadership failure? I was acting on the principle of efficiency, Julian tried, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally and finding none. The trip was an unnecessary cost. The process should have been manageable digitally. Should have been, Mr. Albright repeated, the words dripping with ice. But it wasn't. And no one thought to check? No one thought to consider the history of this partnership. This was my moment. The room was silent, waiting. I could have opened my portfolio. I could have projected the timeline onto the screen, a public crucifixion in PowerPoint. I could have watched the life drain from Julian's face as every email, every ignored warning, was laid bare for all to see. But as I looked at him, sweating in his expensive suit, I felt no triumph. Only a deep, weary sadness. Destroying him wouldn't restore my father's legacy. It wouldn't undo the damage. It would only feed a part of me that I didn't want to exist. So, I kept the portfolio closed. Instead, I spoke, my voice calm and clear in the suffocating silence. The process didn't break down, Mr. Albright, I said, looking not at Julian, but at my father's old partner. It was dismantled. The annual trip to Florence was never about cost. It was about respect. It was about a relationship with a man, Senior Conti, who believes that a handshake is more binding than a digital signature. I made this clear when the responsibility was reassigned in April. I provided all the necessary history, contacts, and a warning about the inflexibility of the deadline. I paused, then added, all of which was documented and confirmed as received. I didn't need to say more. The quiet, factual statement was more damning than any accusation. It pointed to a deliberate choice, not an oversight. It laid the blame exactly where it belonged, on a philosophy that had mistaken tradition for weakness and relationships for inefficiencies. Mr. Albright stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a dawning understanding and a profound regret. Then he turned his gaze back to Julian. He didn't need to say a word. The look on his face was enough. Julian, he said, his voice final. Please pack your personal belongings. We will have security escort you out. Julian sat frozen for a second, his mouth slightly agape. The color drained from his face. He looked around the room one last time, then stood up slowly, a man hollowed out from the inside. He walked out of the room without looking back. The door clicked shut behind him, and the room exhaled. In the days that followed, a strange calm descended on Redwood Mills. The crisis was far from over. Lawyers were called, frantic apologies were made to London, and Mr. Albright was preparing to fly to Florence himself, to beg for forgiveness from Senior Conti. But the source of the chaos was gone. The loud, empty jargon was replaced by the low, urgent murmur of people trying to fix a problem. Mr. Albright called me into his office. The motivational posters were gone, replaced by the old framed photographs of the mill and its people. He looked older, more tired than I had ever seen him. Cora, he began, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. I cannot apologize enough. I let this happen. I was swayed by the talk of modernization, and I lost sight of what your father and I built. I lost sight of our soul. He pushed a folder across the desk. This is a new contract. We're creating a new position for you, Chief Heritage Officer. It comes with a seat on the board, a significant salary increase, and full, unassailable authority over all our legacy partnerships. We need you, Cora. More than ever. I looked at the folder, at the promise of everything I thought I had wanted: recognition, authority, the power to protect my father's legacy. 6 months ago, I would have wept with gratitude. But something in me had irrevocably shifted. I had spent months watching the soul of the company be attacked, and I had learned that a title and a salary couldn't protect it if the culture itself was vulnerable. More importantly, I had learned something about myself. My worth wasn't tied to a title at Redwood Mills. My identity wasn't confined to these brick walls. I had honored my father by upholding his values, not by clinging to his company. I had found a quiet strength in setting a boundary and letting the consequences fall where they may. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a drop of dark blue wax. It was our Bellamy parchment. I slid it gently across the desk, on top of his offer. "This is my resignation, Mr. Albright," I said softly. He looked from the envelope to my face, his expression one of pure shock. "But why?" "You won. We're getting rid of everything he did. We can rebuild it. The way it was." "I know," I said, and my smile was genuine, free of sadness for the first time in months. "But I don't think you can. The world has changed, and maybe Redwood needs to change with it. But I've realized that I don't. I spent my whole life stewarding my father's legacy. I think it's time I started building my own." I stood up. "My mother always wanted me to spend a year in Florence," I said, more to myself than to him. "To learn the language, to study the art, to find her roots." He stared at me, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful respect. "Your father would be so proud of you, Cora." "I know," I whispered. And for the first time, I truly believed it. I walked out of Redwood Mills without looking back. I didn't take a box of personal items. My memories were not things that could be packed. I walked into the soft Northwood rain, feeling lighter than I had in years. That evening, I didn't book a flight. I bought a one-way ticket. Florence. As the plane climbed above the clouds, leaving the Cascade River and the old brick mill behind, I felt no regret. Only a quiet, thrilling sense of peace. I was not flying toward a business meeting or a certification renewal. I was flying toward a city of art and light, toward the memory of my mother, toward a future that was unwritten, on a page that was beautifully, perfectly blank. And for the first time in a long time, I was the one holding the pen.